Hello and welcome to another episode of Behind the Story. I'm your host, Eli Sherman. This week I'm joined by my co-host, Dan McGowan of the Boston Globe. And Dan, we are talking a familiar topic.
We never stop talking about the Washington Bridge, Eli.
I think, the bridge closed, of course, in December 2020. What was it? Three.
Yeah.
And now it's not going to be open until, they think, the end of 2028. We are going to be talking about this quite a bit. And to do that with us this week is the one and only Jim Hummel of the Hummel Report. Jim, welcome to Behind the Story.
Thank you, Eli. Now, I understand you haven't made it in this market until Charlie Hall's done a cartoon on you, or you've been on Behind the Story. So I guess this is it.
You've done it.
My career was peaked.
You're peaking.
No, I do appreciate you inviting me on because we get to dig a little beyond the headlines. Right?
Well,
Exactly.
and I got to tell you guys, I'm just privileged to sit back here because I feel like you two have been digging in on the Washington Bridge, really like pulling back, breaking stories, pulling back the curtain on things. I'm just going to sit back here and ask like dumb questions for the people in traffic.
No such thing as a dumb question.
Well, the reason Jim is on this week is not just because he's been covering the bridge very well for the entire time that has been broken, but he just came out with a story called A Politically Charged Scenario, Docs Show What Wasn't Released in Washington Bridge Reports. And I just to maybe set the stage here, Jim, if you could talk about a little bit about what you got your hands on and what was the most significant finding that jumped out to you.
Yeah, I think when we're telling a story, especially when I was in television, my concern was always making the story complete. Because sometimes what you leave out of the story can be the best part. And in this case, that's what we focused on, what got left out of the forensic report. We all know that was the one that was leaked back in last month. And so what I got my hands on was a tranche of documents, some early drafts of the forensic report by Wis Janey Elsner. And what I found was the engineers were going back and forth talking about when did this rod, the big rod that everybody knows about, how long it had been deteriorating. And the early draft said, look, we think it goes beyond the 6 months, which DOT Director Peter Alviti had talked about. Oh, there's catastrophic event and the rod snapped. The engineers said, we think the corrosion may have gone back 15 years or more. And so that caught my attention. I thought, I haven't seen any of that. Well, all of that didn't make it into the final report. And I found that interesting.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much information that's come out at us over the last couple years. And I think we actually have a little bit of sound of that original thing that Director Peter Alviti said way back. I believe he first said it in December of 2023, right after the bridge broke. This was his explanation for why the bridge had failed.
Finding was the failure of several critical structural components on that bridge. The failure is such that it could potentially be the cause of a catastrophic failure.
So that really became sort of a mantra, a catastrophic failure. You said it yourself. And we should remind folks, just to keep everything straight in their head, that forensic audit that Jim is referencing is, of course, was supposed to trigger this day of reckoning by the governor to hold people accountable. We know that audit ended up getting actually shelved for over a year because they then sued 13 companies and started this whole legal process. But we did find out quite a few new things from that audit, and now, of course, because of your subsequent reporting.
And the timeline was December 11th, it shut down, and then they scrambled to get this audit. And Wis Janey's a national company, no problem going to them. But what I also found was there were some emails back and forth from the engineers saying, can I get updates at noon every day? I mean, we're under a lot of pressure from the state government officials, administration, DOT, because they want answers. And one of the guys said, oh, I've never had that request before. And,
Right.
you know, an inspector's like, let me do my job. You know, it's like if you have an editor coming to you, hey, get me that copy. Let me finish it. And then you have to say that respectfully,
You
right?
don't think of an audit as something that would give you these regular updates.
I will
right?
say,
It's
though,
a meticulous
I
process.
read this a little bit differently and thought, I was a little bit relieved to know that the government was putting some pressure on to say, like, hey, we really need to be on top of this. But what I'm struck by, Jim, and I'm wondering, you know, who you think sort of looks the worst from the reporting that you've done. And the reason I say that is, you know, this goes back 15 years. It's easily, for the current governor, for Governor McKee, he could start to say, well, look, this goes back to Governor Kucheri, Governor Chafee, certainly Gina Raimondo. But at the same time, I don't think the average person that is stuck on the bridge really cares about whose fault it is.
No, it's the guy who's sitting in the corner office right now.
So do you think this absolves him in any way?
Well, no, because every day we all have to face it, particularly we're living and working in the East Bay. You have to cross it every day. I will tell you that I wonder, I have had more people say, where's Gina Raimondo in all this? And I had heard that there was a lot of pressure when she was Commerce Secretary. My thought was when they first opened up the investigation, the DOJ was going to come in, the Federal Department of Justice, because there was federal highway money.
Right.
And all this millions that literally went into the Seekonk River when they knocked it down. The feds had been the saving grace in Rhode Island for how many years? They prosecuted Buddy Cianci. They've done the Three Stooges in North Providence. You remember that case, the councilman? And I wondered, where is the federal investigation? I have heard through some sources, haven't confirmed it, that there was pressure from the administration, the Biden administration, we can't have backsplash on our Commerce Secretary, your former governor. And that's just a loose end. I've always kind of wondered where Raimondo is in all this. She hired Peter Alviti, and McKee's only had him for, 4 or 5 years? But people don't care. If they're sitting in traffic, they want to know. And they also want to know nobody's been suspended, nobody's lost their job, nobody has been held accountable because they all hide behind the lawsuit. And that is so aggravating for most people.
Yeah, I think it's aggravating for most people. And also, the interesting thing about this has been, sure, I think everybody can understand this clearly didn't happen on Governor McKee's watch in the time that he became the governor. Obviously, you proved it now with some of the reporting, but that was sort of somewhat obvious. But keeping Peter Alviti in place is a sign that, hey, I'm not willing to make a change. And I think that's why it sort of falls on Governor McKee in a lot of ways.
Well, I also think this is a surprise to, maybe not a surprise, it's confirmed what a lot of people have thought. These rods and this corrosion goes way back. But there were inspection reports that the DOT had from all these outside contractors who they're now suing that have said, look, you've got clogged scuppers. That's one thing I wrote about. There's concrete. They've got trees growing out of them. And it's the same report year after year, and it doesn't seem like they fixed it at all. And so, look, Peter Alviti was there reading those reports. The governor wasn't, but he was their guy. Layers and layers of people in DOT who knew about these problems. And if you really went back, you'd probably have to find the guy who's, collecting a state pension in Sarasota to figure out, okay, who was really responsible for this and who started turning a blind eye.
One of the things, going back to the audit itself and the communications that you got your hands on, that really jumped out at me was this line that was written, quote, edit as you see fit. Did you get the feeling like because of this politically charged, this government pressure that was going on while they were putting this together, that they were being pushed one way or the other to write this report in a way that...
That's the story. If I was on the oversight committee, anybody watching this, if you're on the oversight committee, I would want to know from DOT, and I asked this question, they don't answer our questions, anything bridge related. What were the parameters for West Janey? Was it totally no guardrails? Did they want you to focus on one specific thing? Were there any directions when they hired you? What did they tell you to do? Because, the logical conclusion would be, hey, we got to soften this up a little bit. But we have no proof of that. And until you get somebody from DOT under oath or you bring West Janey in, you may not get the answer to that question.
You're truly a TV man because you know how to segue. We have to take a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about that very oversight that Jim is referring to. Stick with us. Hello, and welcome back to Behind the Story. I'm your host, Eli Sherman, joined by my co-host, Dan McGowan of the Boston Globe, and our guest this week is Jim Hummel of the Hummel Report. Now, Jim, we are talking about your fabulous reporting on the Washington Bridge, specifically looking at material that was not included in an audit report that everyone is now familiar with that came out last month. And I just had a specific question about Pier 6, because that is where the bridge failed. That's the span of road where this rod broke. And, there was a lot of discussion in those omissions about Pier 6. And I was wondering, Was all that disclosed before, or was this really new stuff for you when you saw it?
Some of it had been disclosed and some of it was new. I found, and I honed in on the discussion among the engineers at West Cheney, and that really shows you how the sausage is made. I think it's like when you put a story together. You go through various drafts, you have an editor look at it, should we include this? But I thought at the end of the day, some of their conclusions you didn't see, and so the subsection was the metallurgical report, and that has never been published. It's never been put, and it's only a 4-page report, but what they started with, and they had 3 revisions from February 1st to February 19th of 2024, and there's only a fleeting mention of it in the 64-page West Cheney report. And I find, again, sometimes what you leave out of a story can affect as much as what you put in. And I think that's really the headline in this story, what the public and what maybe government officials or DOT didn't see.
Well, we're now pivoting to a big oversight hearing that's going to come sometime next month with the House and the Senate, and they're gearing up for it. The last time we had these oversight hearings, what you were reminded of, and it's all respect to the legislators, but they're not engineers, right? And so oftentimes you get questions that are sort of wildly out of focus.
And Mike Chippendale was doing his best.
Right.
And he was shut down in some ways. And they said, we don't want to hear it, right?
Well, and so now I'm curious, now that we've seen an audit come out, we've seen your reporting come out, what would you ask if you were the rep from Barrington to try to, what would be what's the number one question you have right now?
Well, the number one question is, how forthright is Peter Alviti going to be? I mean, we can get to the questions, but you got to get out of the blocks before you get to the rest of the race. And the question I have is, there's got to be discussions going on behind the scenes with Speaker Sicarci, Senate President Val Lawson, the governor, because what you don't want to get out there is have it get out there and look like a debacle.
Right.
So there's got to be that pre-game planning. All right, what are the parameters here? Because every time we have talked to DOT, they've said, no, we can't because of the lawsuit. Now, I talked to Joe Sicarci right after the session. I did a lengthy interview, and he said, well, subpoena power, that's a dramatic step. Well, if there was ever any time that we needed a dramatic step, now would be the time.
When you're the governor, say would be kind of offensive to put him under oath, which is similarly.
Well, he says that, but I mean, look, if they subpoena him and bring him in, I don't know what would happen then, but I would like. If I had Peter Alviti in the seat, I would say, given all of what we know now, did you not see this come? Were you surprised when you had to shut down the bridge? And then the follow-up question would be, you have all these reports that say deterioration, deterioration, deterioration. Did none of this come across your desk? And if not, why not? Right. And it would be interesting to see what he says. Yeah, I was surprised, or maybe I wasn't so surprised. Now, none of us, I think, are surprised that it ultimately got shut down, given all these reports that seemingly were ignored over the years.
Yeah. It's interesting, excuse me, the Senate Minority Leader, I should say, Senator Jessica De La Cruz, she came out making the point like, look, every time you testify before Congress, you're sworn under oath. And there's been this real pushback from the McKee administration. We are not going to testify in front of your oversight committee under oath. And you've been around a long time, Jim. What do you make of that sort of power dynamic between the executive branch and the legislature, and how they can play ball on a topic that is, so important to so many people in the state?
Well, then the question always, and I've done this for years when I've ambushed people in trying to get them to answer questions and they run away. I said, if you've got nothing to hide, why don't you talk to me? Right. It's a simple leverage to say, what are you hiding? Now, maybe answering legislators in the overall scheme of things is down on their totem pole in terms of seriousness. But I think it sends an awful look to the public. Oh, we're trying to be transparent. Why won't you answer my questions?
Ironically, though, I would say this. I covered the Providence City Council for years and years and years. John Igliozzi, who's the chief of staff of the Department of Transportation, was notorious for threatening to put people under oath. And I will say, my perception as a reporter in the room often was he was doing it as a little bit of theater. It was so I would write that he's going to put the finance director under oath kind of thing. And so I do wonder that there is some level of theatrics to it. And I wonder, will it actually result in anything? Because you may not be able to prove that someone definitively lied under oath, even if they, even if you prove that maybe they misled the public and things like that. And then what is the penalty anyway?
What's the next step? Let's say Peter Alviti gets put under oath, or somebody from the Department of Transportation. They say, I've been advised not to speak. Well, then is it criminal contempt? Is it civil contempt? Do you take it to a judge? Does it get that far? I mean, we really are in uncharted
And
water.
inevitably, the people who are the angriest, who have whether it's the Republicans or whether it's maybe East Bay
Democrats who live in
who have
Bay,
a reason to be upset about it, they're going to make it a thing and say, oh, clearly we should hold them in contempt. You're going to have probably somebody like the speaker who's maybe running for governor and trying to think about how to massage this a little more. So it feels like it's going to be chaos no matter what.
And I think one thing I'd like your take on, Jim, is because we heard from Director Peter Alviti in the first segment there. His employment, he has been so resilient through all of this and keeping his job. Governor McKee has stood by him, but it seems like he might be becoming somewhat of a litmus test in the upcoming gubernatorial election because you already have Democratic challenger Helena Foulkes coming out saying she would fire him if she was in charge. Do you expect him and his role in government to continue to play a role in political discussion?
Let's see how the campaign goes, because if McKee, his bad poll numbers continue, maybe at some point during the campaign he says, look, it's gotten so bad I really need to let the director go. No, I have no evidence that that's going to happen. But if you're looking for a big public statement, and again, I think we all like Peter Alviti. There's nothing personal here, and he's been amiable up until this point. He's always been pretty accessible. But I think at some point, if the governor's really worried about his political future, Peter Alviti's tied directly to that because of the Washington Bridge. And I think there's been a miscalculation by his campaign about how serious this is. And it goes back to, remember, Gina Jam, which Alan Fung talked about. At the time, the governor still lives in Cumberland. He's the lieutenant governor. Gina Raimondo lives in Providence, or did, and Peter Alviti's in Coventry. Right. And it wasn't unless you lived in the East Bay. They tore up those 2 lanes in 2018, and it was back to, it seems kind of the salad days now. Right? It really wasn't compared to what we go through, but it was backed up to Seekonk. Somebody finally got in Raimondo's ear and said, if you want to win this campaign, you got to stop. So that led to Carty Corporation and the termination. But I live in the East Bay, and I was on the radio filling in on WPRI. I said, I invite the governor. Our kids are out of the house. The governor can come stay overnight with me. We can put the trooper in my son's room, and they can make that commute in every day, and it'll change your mind. And I think somebody on the campaign told Raimondo that. So to try to downplay it during the campaign is not a good strategy.
And it's clearly your fault then, right? It could have been closed then, not for you.
That is true. I always used to say East Bay rules, West Bay drools, but in the last 2 years, it's been a little tough to say that.
Well, like I said off the top of the show, we are going to be talking about this topic for a long time to come. But for now, we got to take another quick short break. For people who want to know more about his reporting and just generally good journalism, make sure that you follow Jim Hummel. Jim, thank you so much for being on.
Thanks for having me, guys.
All right, when we come back, the stories we wish we wrote. Stick with us. Hello and welcome back to Behind the Story. I'm your host, Eli Sherman, joined by my co-host, Dan McGowan of the Boston Globe. We are entering into the final segment of our show, The Stories We Wish We Wrote, where we talk about other great journalism that's happening around the region and brag about it. So, Dan, we talked about reports on the first 2 segments of this show, and we're talking about more.
Let's go for another. We love reports in this market and in this industry. My colleagues Ed Fitzpatrick and Amanda Milkovich had a good sit-down interview with outgoing now Attorney General Peter Nerona, and they had a bunch of.
He's got some time left.
Yeah, he's got a year. Yeah. They've got a bunch of stories that came from it, but one that I think was really interesting and flew under the radar is he said to them basically without even asking, "Hey, we've got this report that analyzes 70 years of clergy abuse. 400 pages is going to be in this report." Now, he didn't give them the report, but he made it very clear that this is going to be pretty scathing, and he says it's going to come out likely before the end of the year, although he thinks there's a chance that maybe the church will potentially go to court to block it. So there's some messiness at play, but I think there's kind of dark times ahead for the Catholic Church.
Yeah, well, so let me get this straight. They were talking about him about something totally unrelated, and he brought this up.
Classic Peter Nerona. This was an interview about sort of not running for governor, and it was also about, they did a great story on how the court, a lot of federal lawsuits are being filed in district court in Rhode Island. So they were there to talk to him about that, and then boom, look, there's this report coming, and of course, again, reporters love reports.
Now, I do want to warn viewers, because I've covered Peter Nerona a long time, and he has promised that this report will come out for several years now. So if you're holding your breath for it coming out before the end of the year, just be warned that I've heard that before.
Santa may come before this report comes out.
Well, that's great, and they did a great job with that. Always a good topic. Well, not a good topic, but an important topic. Yeah. I took a look at a report in the Rhode Island Current, and it is the Rhode Island cannabis retail licenses could be ready by May 2026.
Wait, is this our friend Nancy Lavin?
No, this is Alexander Cass.
Okay, good. So Nancy doesn't get on top of the leaderboard then.
Yeah, exactly. And so, this story is important because another topic that's been sort of ongoing for a really long time is, where are these marijuana retail licenses?
That's right.
They passed the legalization of recreational marijuana in 2024, maybe?
I think it was 3, yeah.
And so now here we are all this time later, and they haven't expanded it beyond the 3 licenses that it currently exists. Well, no, it's actually expanded beyond that, but there are all these people who are waiting for licenses, and they haven't come out. And now the chair of the Cannabis Control Commission has now stepped down, Kim Ahern, and she, talking about Attorney General, it's widely thought that she may be considering a run for that.
Yeah, and she's going to have to answer questions about sort of how she handled this, and I'm sure she's going to have a prepared answer for sort of how complicated it is. But it is true. I mean, I think we're all waiting. We get lots of emails from readers and things like that to say, hey, when is this going to be? When is the retail pot shop going to open on the corner of? There's just a story in the Globe about in Cambridge, a daycare, pot shop, and something else. I think people are waiting for that here, although that we'll be covering those stories too.
Yeah, I remember back to covering the recreational marijuana rollout in Massachusetts when it was happening, and there was just this thought that you would see them on a corner store like a liquor store.
Right.
And that the speed of which that coming out is obviously not moving very quickly. Who knows, maybe in 50 years we'll be laughing back at the taping of this and being like, well, they didn't know anything. You had another one we can get through real quick before we got to.
Yeah, very quickly. Katie Mulvaney in the Providence Journal had a fun story about this kind of ongoing legal battle about King Richard's Fair in Carver, right?
Right.
And there's this battle about the land and sort of who's to blame for the kind of the place is going through some struggles. And so Katie Mulvaney captures it really well through legal documents, and pretty good story.
Yeah, she always does such a great job covering the legal community here in Rhode Island and beyond. But that is all the time that we have this week. We always appreciate you watching. If you want to check out this episode or any other episode, you can find them on our website, WPRI.com, or on YouTube. We also now have this as a podcast, so go download it wherever you get your podcasts. Next week, we'll have another great guest on to talk about news in the region. But for now, for Dan McGowan, I'm Eli Sherman. Thank you for watching Behind the Story.